So I spent some time going down the Greta Thunberg rabbit hole over the past week. First of all, I just wanted to, in case somebody out there doesn't know about this, wanted to talk a little bit about who she is and what this climate strike idea is all about. Greta Thunberg is 16 years old now. She is from Sweden. And last year at a certain point, she decided to not attend school, and instead she sat outside the Swedish legislature every day for 3 weeks. She was kind of famous for sitting there alone. She wasn't going to attend school until the Swedish general election, which was 3 weeks off, so she did do that and then began the practice that is now worldwide of protesting on Fridays or staying out of school striking on Friday. I contemplated why this person had become quite as iconic as she has, and I think there's something to be said for the phenomenon of young people leading, and that led me to think of Joan of Arc and the parallels there, and why it was that this figure of Joan of Arc was so very compelling and still is in our minds. I also thought of the Children's Crusade from the Middle Ages, and just generally this idea of youthful purity, I guess you might say, the idea of unspoiled youth and how moral leadership can come from unspoiled youth, and maybe particularly from females who are seen to be the most unspoiled in the popular mind. I guess what I'm saying is that that type of association goes way, way back in our minds. So there's something mesmerizing and powerful about a young lady or youth generally becoming active and speaking out. But I don't just want to talk about Greta Thunberg. The overall movement has many facets. The organization that she's most, her reputation is most attached to is Fridays for Future. She's also been supportive of the group Extinction Rebellion that I mentioned briefly last time. There's a whole bunch of these groups around the world. These are 3 more that pop up frequently: Earth Uprising, Zero Hour, Sunrise Movement. And each of them has their particular take on what to do and how to do it, but all of them kind of circle around this idea that people, and particularly young people, need to get out and make demands and demand change in legislation, in regulations, in order to rein in carbon emissions. The audience for these demands tends to be governmental. International bodies like the United Nations, for instance. Greta Thunberg and other youth leaders from different organizations and different nations gave speeches at the United Nations, and you can find that online. They also have the audience, of course, of world leaders generally and legislatures. So, and finally, implicit, if not explicit, in their statements is that older citizens generally need to change their habits, and that they need to listen to the younger people because it's the younger people who are going to outlive them and have to deal with the climate problems that they leave behind. Their style is to make demands, hold protests, make demands, and it's a very tried and true strategy. At the national level, the demand seems to be to make changes to reduce carbon emissions before the tipping point, wherever that is. People argue about it, scientists, I guess, even argue about exactly, have we already reached the tipping point where, the acceleration of climate change is kind of unstoppable, or are we almost there? The assumption in Thunberg's rhetoric seems to be that we are almost there, that we have a good chance, maybe a 50-50 chance, I think she said at one point, to avoid tipping over that point where we can't really stop the change. At the international level, this is expressed as a demand that the countries of the world abide by the Paris Climate Agreement of 2016, and in particular there's angst, of course, and ire with the United States, which has recently withdrawn from the climate agreement. And at the individual level, the demand is that people need to change their personal behavior. So they need to do things like drive their car less and take public transportation, perhaps. Thunberg, when she came over to the United States to speak to Congress, came famously in a zero carbon footprint or carbon impact yacht. Now, there's some underlying assumptions behind these demands, okay? And I think that more thought needs to be given to the assumptions by the young people and older people involved in these movements. First, one big assumption is that governments are still a potent source of change, if not the most potent source of change. Okay? The second assumption is that international agreements can be a reliable means of change, that international agreements matter. And a third assumption is that personal change will add up to collective change, that if you persuade enough people to change their habits, this too will result in pressure on the overall system to change its ways. It hasn't been clear to me what the personal change is supposed to be for sure, and I think that's an area where there might be some really fruitful thought given to exactly what kind of personal change are we talking about. But I mean, despite the fact that there are many problems associated with all ideological, political, economic movements, I generally really like this one because I think they are trying to address something that is of utmost importance to us all, the future of our planet. I don't know how you could get a whole lot more important than that, so I'm not going to quibble with that. But there are pitfalls that I would like people involved in this movement, like Greta Thunberg, to fully contemplate and understand so as to avoid them. Let's just take each of those three assumptions and look at the pitfalls. The first pitfall is that governments may be too captured by their economic interests to be able to act without a huge push. In other words, the governments of the world, and particularly in those that call themselves democratic, economic interests are so entrenched in the political process, and I'm sure everybody in those movements kind of intellectually fathoms this, but so entrenched that both left and right wings within those governments are likely to only go so far because their power is so propped up by the economic system the way it is. Climate strikes, school strikes, especially if they're sporadic, an event which then stops and things go back to normal, is probably not enough to bust through the entrenched economic interests and the habits that almost all candidates, left, right, and center, are subject to. Okay, another pitfall when it comes to international agreements, we have to fully fathom that there is no independent means of enforcement. So in the past, international agreements have only been as good as the collective will of the countries involved. And the latest demonstration of this is that the United States withdraws from the Paris Climate Agreement. There is absolutely nothing that can be done of any substance to punish the United States or make the United States comply. We're sort of reduced to pleading with the United States government to be reasonable, but it's a sovereign power. And so international agreements are probably not something to hang your hat on or your hopes on. A third caveat or pitfall is at the personal level. Personal change is heavily subject to being co-opted by economic imperatives, okay? And I'll give you two very different, well, not so very different, but examples, okay? The 60s generation protested, their big issue was anti-war, right? They wanted to stop the huge war machine, particularly they saw it in the United States, but you might as well make it an international phenomenon, the huge war economy, of course, like all the damage that's done to the environment. One could even argue that without the war economy, well, the environment would be a lot better off. It might be the number one source, and then number two, or like tied with war economy, is probably big agriculture, the way we feed ourselves. But they were protesting this. They were earnest. They went pretty far. They shut things down. They were sometimes very, very disruptive. And they did have the effect of getting the United States out of the Vietnam War. But yet ultimately, they themselves did not ultimately change. Or they got co-opted, which means that most of them, not all of them, but most of them, after kind of having this impetuous youth where they really were, they did demonstrate that they had quite a bit of political power. They were acting like citizens. Well, they got jobs. They got families. They, like everybody else, wanted comfort and security. Many of the brightest ones got great jobs with major corporations, with think tanks, with universities, with journalistic outlets, all of which made them quite personally conservative, even if they were Democratic voters, let's say. Personally conservative meaning there's only so much change they would be willing to imagine. So this is a well-known phenomenon here in the United States. We all know that. There's not very many hippies these days, ready to disrupt the entire country to stop anything. And so that's one example. Second example is ubiquitous, okay, and ongoing, which is that as soon as people get an idea that they as individuals are going to change their habits, well, as Zizek, whose book I'm reading right now, this one, The Courage of Hopelessness, as he says, there's always a company, always a product, always somebody going to swoop down and basically sell you something different, right? So right now we have, for instance, just tons of companies starting to sell you plastic-free products and, organic everything. And so but all of this means that we can continue to grow and consume as much as we ever did, but we feel like we've changed our life because we're buying something different. But I'm suggesting that is basically another illusion. And Thunberg likes to talk about how we live in a dreamland. That is a dreamland indeed. So the personal change is harder than we can imagine because the system is set up to kind of accommodate the desire for personal change and co-opt it. So keeping that in mind, I thought, well, what would I suggest to people involved in this movement, especially people at the top? Well, I would not actually argue to stop or, give the ultra cynical response of, what are you doing this for? It's not going to matter. I would say keep doing what you're doing because it is having some effect, and in the short run, even limited government and international action will help. It may not be everything, but it adds up. And also, by keep doing what you're doing, you are creating networks, and I would say focus on the creation of those networks because those are probably more valuable than any given strike or action. And I'll mention why in the next slide. Personal change can focus minds on the problem. It's not enough, and it usually gets co-opted, but it can make you wake up and start listening and thinking more deeply. But I would say do more than that. Lead through action. I watched this Vice documentary when one of the students involved basically said that somebody had thrown it back on them and said, well, why don't you come up with solutions? And she said, well, because we're just high schoolers. Well, I'm a university professor. I can tell you that some of the smartest people I'll ever know have been students of mine ranging from, say, 18 to 25. And we got a lot of people out there that are quite brilliant. And so I don't think it's a joke to ask for leadership from this generation. Partly because this is the generation that has the most access to information and the ability to self-educate like never before. So the very brightest people have access to quite a bit more personal education and growth than they would have in the past, and there's more of them. So I think it's actually legitimate to say you can lead, not just plead. I would ask those involved to please study political philosophy, history, and economics so you don't make the same mistakes that people have made so many times in the past, which lead to the fizzling out of movements right when they start to become successful. I would also ask for them to seek appropriate allies financially who aren't dependent upon continued growth. There's a tendency in these movements to take money where they can get it because they need it to be able to communicate well. But think about why so many well-to-do foundations exist. They exist because there's an abundance of money at the top, and that money goes into foundations partly as surplus and partly as a way of kind of ameliorating guilt or, a feeling of social responsibility. But again, foundations and grant-making agencies that rely upon excessive wealth are not going to support movements that challenge that excessive wealth and the system that it's built on. I was thinking of the people in Hong Kong, the protesters in Hong Kong. I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that basically said that their elders were supplying them behind the scenes. This was a real grassroots kind of thing. They weren't relying on foundations. They were relying on their older allies, their family, their friends. They created intergenerational bonds, and these people were like, we may be too old to do this ourselves, but we will help you in concrete ways by making up your income, by buying your gas masks and all that, right? So there are different sources of alliances, and they probably do matter. It probably does matter where you get your funding from. There are so many scarily bright people in this generation that it is not good enough to say, you older people, work it out, or we have the science already. That's true. Everybody knows it's not enough to just, listen to the science because so many people won't listen to it. Why not create brain trusts out of people in your generation and their allies using the best technology available so that you don't have to go around the world to conferences, but can start really creating ideas for how we can actually live in this new and changing future in very different ways. If we want to be threatening, start talking about creating communities that run on very different mechanisms than the way they run now, by relying on each other, by sharing equipment and goods, by supplying at a local level many of the things that we need, by using appropriate level technology to do it in a smart way. If we want to be threatening, I can't think of a more threatening thing to do than to basically say, we won't be beholden to your money anymore. Will career matter more to you at some point? Will there be that natural slide into personal conservative, circle the wagons thinking, or are you the generation that can actually stay the course and get things done